Hey guys, welcome to the weekly question video where we answer your questions. If you would like to submit a question to be featured on one of these videos, the details on how to do that are down in the description box, as well as a link to our Patreon if you want to support what we're doing and get bonus content. So these weekly question videos, I typically pull a question either from our comment section or from an email that we've received, or even from our Discord community that is for our patrons. I'll pull a question, I'll answer it. But this week I wanted to do something slightly different. So I thought that this week I would go through a story time, talk about my most recent punishment and the details around that. And if you like these Storytime podcasts, over on our Patreon, I do weekly, just kind of a weekly catch-up video, and if we had a punishment that week, that I usually talk through it and kind of do more of a Storytime style video. So if you really enjoy that content, definitely check out our Patreon, because that is where I talk more candidly and more openly about our relationship and what I'm going through and my growth as a taken in hand in this process. If you like these story times, you get so much more of that over on our Patreon. So if you've been around the podcast for any length of time, especially if you've listened to those old episodes, you will know that one of our longest standing rules is a bedtime and a wake up time for me. And that is because I am a total night owl, and to the point of being self-destructive in the lack of sleep that I will get naturally if I don't have my head of household coming in and saying, no, you're not going to do that. And so we had gone through the weekend and things had kind of gotten a little off track, but Coda was bringing me back in. And so he had said, I'm going to be strict with you. You have your bedtime and your wake up times back in place this week. I want you to, adhere to that. And I totally was on board. There was no pushback from me on that. I knew that it was necessary. And so he set my bedtime, set my wake up time. Now he wakes up and goes to work before my set wake up time. I feel like so many people will, head of households, taken in hands, just people in general, will be like, you don't wake up and make him breakfast. I would if he wanted me to. He doesn't eat breakfast. And so he does not see the purpose or value of me waking up with him. Because he basically just kind of gets ready, gathers his stuff, and is out the door. And so my set wake up time is about 30 minutes after he leaves for work. But he wakes up and takes the dog on the walk in the morning. And for the last 3 weeks, this dog has been waking me up in the process of getting up for her walk. So I had not needed to set an alarm, even though I was still setting alarm. I hadn't actually needed my alarm because the dog would wake me up and then I would just kind of wake up at that point, and it was well before my alarm would go off. And so after the weekend, we were getting back on schedule, I completely forgot to set my alarm because the dog had been waking me up. It just didn't even occur to me because I had been waking up without my alarm for the past few weeks. So I completely forgot to set an alarm for the morning. And so I got to bed on time. That was all good. But the next morning, the dog didn't wake me up, and I ended up just completely sleeping in. And without anything there to wake me up, without Coda there, without the dog being a nuisance, without anything else happening, I slept 2 hours past my set wake up time. And so I immediately was I could not believe that I slept in that long. And so I immediately texted Coda and I let him know. I was like, hey, I completely did not, nothing woke me up, and I completely just slept right through, and I'm just now getting up. Now, I did tell him that it was a total mistake. It was not intentional at all. And I did tell him, like, I had scheduled some rest time in the afternoon, but I'm going to use that time to make up for the things that I anticipated getting done in the morning. I'll just shift those to be able to get that done during that uh, period of like rest time that I had scheduled. And I did. I got everything done that day, but Coda basically came back in text. He was like, okay, I understand that you didn't mean to do this, but I'm going to have to think about what's appropriate here. And he took some time to think about it. And then a few hours later, he texted me and he was like, you're going to get a spanking tonight. I did not anticipate that being his decision. And so I didn't get angry. I didn't get upset or anything, but I was upset. I was like sad. I was like, I felt like he should have understood. Like, I didn't mean to. And, my allergies are killing me. I had all the excuses, right? Like, my allergies are killing me. I haven't been sleeping well, and I haven't done this, and the dog didn't wake me up. And I had all the excuses. And so I felt very justified in being able to just write it off as a mistake and to move on. But I didn't text him back. I didn't say anything to him, but I did kind of have that, like, the only word I can use for it is like that internal, like, pouty feeling of like, but I didn't mean to. And so I just texted back, okay, and went through my day. I got everything done. And I think that subconsciously I was still thinking, like, if I get everything done and he sees, like, if he comes home and the house is completely in order and everything's done and I did everything I anticipated on getting done that day and I go through my entire checklist, maybe that'll change his mind. I don't know why I had that subconscious thought process, because that he's never changed his mind once he declares that a punishment is going to happen. And so I don't know why I was thinking that that would be the case. It was not. And so come that evening, he tells me that he wants me to write an apology. That's our version of corner time, because corner time is not something that we have found beneficial to our punishment process, that like pre-spanking corner time. But what we do is Coda will have me write out an apology even for minor misbehaviors, where he wants me to acknowledge what I did, acknowledge that it was wrong, give a plan of action of how I'm going to avoid that in the future, and kind of give the reasons why it's important to have this structure in place. I did not want to do that this time. I was still feeling kind of resistant to the process. Like, I didn't feel like I deserved to be punished. And I didn't feel like, not with a spanking, like, I didn't feel like I should have to go through a punishment for this, because it was a mistake. And I sat, so he came out to our studio, because that's where we have a converted shed in our backyard is where we record, but it's also where we take care of punishment just for privacy's sake. So he came out to our studio and I sat down in our kitchen. I sat down to write this apology and I just was like, I don't want to. It was just ridiculous, the amount of resistance I was putting into this process. And so I was like, okay, my options are not write an apology, and then I will face a more severe punishment for not doing what I was told. Be very short and kind of snarky in my apology, and face a more severe consequence for the attitude. Or I can just do the thing. And so ultimately I decided to just write the apology. Do what I was told, write the apology. My entire mindset shifted. during that writing of the apology. And so it definitely, writing out the apology portion is probably one of the worst parts of my punishment, because it forces me to acknowledge my misbehavior, acknowledge why it was wrong and how it could lead to detrimental outcomes and why it's a rule in the first place. And then I have to come up with like how I'm going to avoid the misbehavior in the future. And so I had to write out this apology, and I got through it, and I was like, by the end of it, I was like, okay, I get it. Because at the end of the day, I did break a rule. And it doesn't matter if I don't think that this punishment is the most appropriate choice. That is not my decision. I need to just accept that this is how Coda is addressing this behavior, because how he addresses it, how I am punished, is his decision. And I just need to accept that, because the way our relationship is set up is that if I do something wrong, he gets to decide how to handle that situation and how that behavior is punished. And so, and I don't need to think about what I would do if I were him. I don't need to think about, all of those things. I just need to accept his decision and yield to his authority and accept my punishment, because I did something wrong, and so I have to accept the consequences of my own actions. And so I wrote out this apology. I handed it to him. He read it, and he's like, okay, I see. And he's like, you hit every point that I was going to hit in the lecture. He's like, doesn't mean you get out of the lecture, but he just said, I am glad to see that you acknowledge where you went wrong and why. And so he proceeds with the spanking. Now, one thing that I can really appreciate is that Coda is very reasonable in how he approaches punishments, because he knows that I was not intentional in my misbehavior. I didn't intentionally sleep that far past my wake up time. And I really did try to not use sleeping in as an excuse to then not do other things around the house or other things that are my responsibility. And so he saw my efforts, he saw my intention, and so because of those things, he decided to make the punishment on the lighter side for our punishment system. Any punishment I get that is a punishment spanking is going to be not fun. It is hard. It is hard to bear. It is something that I do not want to have to go through again. So when I say mild or light, it's only mild or light in comparison to the severity that our punishments could go to. It is not something that is no big deal. It is still something that I dread and I do not want to have to go through. And so he started the spanking with a warm-up, as we always do, and then we have recently started using a long wooden spoon that I picked up at one of these big box home goods stores. After the warm-up, he then used this wooden spoon for 20 swats and lectured in between. And then he followed up with our over-the-knee acrylic paddle that we have that, it is very hard to bear. He only gave me 10 with those, and that was the punishment. And so I really appreciate that he took my intention into consideration, that he realized that my misbehavior was not intentional. So he took that into consideration when deciding the punishment. And because I yielded myself to that process, I went through the writing of the apology. I got my mindset right before I went into the punishment. I was able to yield myself to the process. Once the spanking started, after I got through that punishment, I was no longer defensive. I was no longer resistant. I was no longer in a bad headspace. I no longer had an attitude about the whole thing. And so that's why I say, like, the apology part, although I dread it the most, is probably one of the most important aspects of how we do our punishments now. Because, again, I was able to yield myself to that punishment. Coda didn't have to punish me more severely to get me to actually yield to his authority, because I had already kind of worked through that mental process and mentally prepared myself to yield to his authority before going into it. And so even with a short spanking like that, it did get the point across. It did punish the behavior appropriately, and it put me in a position to come under his authority and to realize that as a taken in hand, I don't have to bother myself with trying to decide if something is fair or not. I can look at something and say, does this fit within how we've structured our relationship and what I've agreed to? And if the answers are like, yes, this is something that fits into our relationship structure and into what I agreed to, no, this does not go beyond a limit that we've talked about, then I don't need to worry about if it's fair. That's Coda's decision. He gets to decide what's fair. I don't need to nitpick his decisions. I don't need to think about, like, well, this isn't fair. This isn't right. He should do this instead. I don't need to burden myself with that thought process. I don't need to even consider that. That's not for me. That's not for my position in our relationship. And so this punishment really did kind of like the whole process of making a legitimate mistake, being faced with punishment when I didn't think that it was fair, having to go through this, writing this apology to acknowledge that it actually is fair, and then going through the punishment itself and being reconciled back into a proper position within my relationship. All of those things created like this perfect storm for me to have this revelation of where I really fit within my role and within my relationship, and why that's important. So I think that's where I'm going to cut this off. I don't want this to get too long. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoy these Storytime videos, again, really consider joining our Patreon, because that is where a lot of these Storytime videos get put. And until next time, we will talk to you later.